I'm going to show you his humanity, is one of the things that John is doing. I'm showing you his humanity. And so you have the physical and the spiritual, and this contrast between belief and unbelief, receiving him, rejecting him, the very idea that he is God in the flesh, and bringing forth that evidence that would allow them to make that decision. Now, as we read the Gospel of John, one of the things that we also have in the present day, and whatever day it is that we read it, whether it was the 15th century or the 19th century or here in the 21st century, it's the same idea, and that is that John is giving enough evidence to provide that evidence to bring us to the point of belief. One of the things that begins in chapter 20 that I find very compelling is that you have the idea of proof promoting faith. Sometimes as Christians, we don't want to admit that, well, I like when I have some proof. Well, we've got to walk by faith, not by sight. We'll quote that verse. We walk by faith, not by sight. Sure, but isn't it great when God provides the evidence and we can taste it and feel it and smell it and we can hear it and we know that it's real, and that evidence then bolsters our faith and produces a greater faith because we see the evidence. Well, that's really what John's doing. John says, here is the visible evidence. Now in chapter 20, you have the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he appears to many, and as he appears to the many, there are those moments of that very thing happening where Thomas would say, my Lord and my God. The very fact of seeing the resurrected Christ, and his faith is then through the roof. He is experiencing that moment of being able to see and to hear and to experience the resurrection, the resurrected Lord, and as a result of that, then the faith is strong. That faith is great. Sometimes I think we don't give that enough credence. We want to talk about living by faith and letting our faith be strong, and yeah, sure, we have to accept a lot of things by faith, but the resurrection of Jesus is not one of those, because we have evidence. We have this evidence, and not just in the Gospel of John, but in the other three Gospels, as well as Paul's writings, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, and there are some other passages as well. All right, what I'd like to do here is, before we go into the resurrection of Jesus, is just ask for a little insight, a little input from you as we've worked our way through 19 chapters, and we reach chapter 20. And the first thing that happens in verses 1 and actually 1 through 10 is the evidence of the empty tomb, the resurrection of Jesus, where Mary comes to the tomb, and Peter and John rush to the tomb, and it's empty, and they see the linen cloth there, everything folded up neatly. And at this point, they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. That ends in verse 10. What is it about these first 20 chapters in the Gospel of John that strikes you as unique or different or special? What is it about these first 20 chapters that we've studied 19, and we have an idea of what's going on in chapter 20? What is it about these that really hits you, or something that is unique, or something special about these chapters in the Gospel of John that you'd like to share with us? Who will go first? Okay.
That's unique.
Mm-hmm.
John gave, this is the gospel of Christ. We've told that in many places, show that. But he told from his perspective that in a way that you could see his love for Christ. He didn't understand everything till the end,
Mm-hmm.
But after his eyes was opened, he was enlightened of what was going on. He knew. But I see it as unique that each one gave it in their own terms. He recorded things that the others didn't. He's a little bit different than the other three, but it was all the life of Christ in his eyes.
Yeah, very good. Good observation. What else are you thinking?
John never intended for his gospel to be a biography.
Right.
The other that wrote his biography, but John was firsthand. He wanted it to be known. It was firsthand.
Yeah, and the idea of him picking and choosing the things that he wanted to include, obviously, as Earl's already said, the Holy Spirit guided him, but still there were those things that were chosen to be in this gospel, many of those not even contained in those others. Yeah, good. What else?
Well, he said the good and the bad. Talk about Peter. And he talked about things that if I was writing it, I probably wouldn't put it in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't want anybody to know that that really happened that way. But he did put that in there for our edification, knowing that Peter, although he was his disciple and apostle, he was a human being and he was human and he made mistakes. And he was just like we are.
Yeah. And one of the things that we sometimes fail to remember is that John's writing this after the fact, and he's also including in this that he lacked a faith as well. He lacked understanding as well. So he's writing it, and he includes himself in that picture as they approach the tomb and they are looking in the tomb. They believed, but they still didn't understand. They still didn't understand what was going on, what was taking place. And he's including himself in that. Yeah, good observation.
I think John is pointing out too, not necessarily so much of the human side of Christ, but the deity that he is the Son of God, just like he begins the book. He's always related to the fact that he is the Son of God. And that's what man put the belief in, that he is the Son of God.
Yeah, the very idea that there were those who denied that God could inhabit flesh, and John really highlights the idea that this Jesus that we're talking about is God, and he was God in the flesh. And though he does talk an awful lot about his godness, and he uses the very words of Jesus to say, I and my Father are one, and I came from my Father, and I'll go back to my Father, and all of those things, he still takes the time to include the fact that he is human. He weeps, and he has those moments of humanness, obviously. Acts chapter 1, verse 3 is one of those passages where it gives us a little bit of understanding about what John is doing here in chapter 20, because in that verse there is this statement, something to the effect, he showed himself alive after his passion by many proofs. So what Luke is saying there is, after the crucifixion, Jesus showed himself to be alive in many different settings, in many different ways, to many different people. We have here a sampling of those that he showed himself to, and then Paul is going to give you a larger sampling in 1 Corinthians 15, but you have some of those recorded here, and that's really what we look at, because you have him appearing to Mary Magdalene, you have him appearing to the disciples in the upper room, he appears to Thomas, and then he appears, and then we have the ending, verses 30 and 31. So you have those three specific ones. Now, if the Gospel of John was an ordinary biography of a man, there would be no chapter 20, would there? Because 20 is about the resurrection. If it was an ordinary biography, it would end in chapter 19 where he died on the cross. That would be the end of it. Well, no, they put him in a tomb. It ended in the tomb. So at the end of chapter 19, he is buried, and that would be the end of the biography. But it's not the end of the Gospels. It's not the end of the Gospel, because in the very next words of chapter 20 is the beginning of the tomb being found empty. So it doesn't end with his death and burial. It continues, and this is what makes this a very uplifting, unique, transforming message, because it is the message of the resurrected Christ. It's not just a dead teacher. It's not one who died and was buried, but it is a resurrected Christ. So chapter 20 opens up. Now it was the first day of the week, and Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, which would be John, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. That's 3 verse 10. So in these passages, the account that John gives is the first day of the week, and you have, when you put them all together, I think in all 4 Gospels there are 5 accounts of appearances. So here you have 3 in the Gospel of John. Luke records the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and also appearing Luke 24. So you have those 2 at least, and then there's the other women in Matthew 28. So you have different accounts from the different Gospels. I don't know exactly what that morning was like. I don't know if it was one of those quiet mornings that would have been maybe a little bit foggy and maybe the dews on the ground. I don't know what it was like, but that's kind of the way I pictured it in my mind. As Mary Magdalene makes her way to that tomb, and we understand that the reason she was going there was to complete that burial process that had been begun 3 days earlier by Joseph and Nicodemus. They weren't able to finish that because of the coming Passover, so they had to hastily get his body wrapped and get him in there and get some of those spices and ointments applied, but they weren't able to finish that. So Mary, it seems, is going back there to finish that burial process. When she arrives, the tomb is open and the body is gone. We could talk about how did she think she's going to get the stone away from the opening, and talk about how it had been sealed by the Romans. The guards were there, and if they fell asleep, how did they have testimony? But the bottom line is there was this obvious emptying of the tomb. And the evidence supported exactly what Jesus said would happen, which would be that he would rise from that grave. The stone was rolled away. The burial linens were laid aside, and the cloth that was over his face was folded and put in a different place, giving evidence that no one stole the body. If you're going to steal the body, you don't unwrap it. You just don't do that. Now, there are some who say that there are other explanations other than the miraculous resurrection from the dead that Jesus claimed and that obviously we believe happens here. There are those things that others say happened. Some of them are preposterous, and we've talked about some of these before. Some are quite preposterous, but one of those is that the women that went early in the morning went to the wrong tomb. Now, I'm sometimes forgetful and I lose my way sometimes, but that's pretty preposterous, isn't it? Yet there are those skeptics who would say that, well, that's all you have. You just have them going to the wrong tomb. That explains it all. Well, that's kind of short-sighted because that doesn't explain everything that happened after that, but we all recognize that that's a very short-sighted one. One of the other most ridiculous ones is that he really wasn't dead. He only swooned or fainted. He lost a lot of blood, and as a result of the beating that he took. But by the way, that would have killed most people at that time, that terrible whipping he took at the hands of the Roman soldiers. That would have killed most folks, but he's then crucified, and their take is that, well, he just fainted, and somewhere after being placed in that cool tomb, he came to his senses and walked out. Well, that's just as silly as it can be, and I don't mean to make light of someone who might believe that swoon theory, but according to that theory, he didn't actually die, he just fainted. Yeah. Well, you have Pilate, who believes he was dead. You have the soldiers who dealt in death that would testify that he was dead, and so the facts seem to say that he was dead. There are others who try to explain. There are others that, being skeptics, try to blame it on the fact that either the disciples stole the body or the enemy stole the body. Let's take those separately. If the enemy, if the Jews or the Romans stole the body, what makes that such a preposterous claim? Okay. And then when the disciples get up and they begin to preach the resurrected Jesus, if I'm the enemy and I've got the body, what am I going to do?
That's why they sealed the tomb and put the guards there.
Yeah. To keep them from stealing it, yes.
They're gonna bring that body out.
Well, I'm going to produce that body. I'm going to say, you're a bunch of liars. Yeah, you're a bunch of liars. You're preaching that this Christ is resurrected. We stole the body. So, why is it very unlikely that the disciples would have stolen the body?
One reason there was Roman guards.
Yeah. What would have been the punishment if they had been caught trying to steal it, or if they had been caught with it?
Well, they probably would have killed on the side just to show up there.
Yeah.
As a disciple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And by the way, where do we know they were during this time?
If they stole the body, they proved themselves that Christ wasn't God.
Oh, exactly. Yes. Mm-hmm. So where were they during these 3 days? They were hiding. It seems very clear that they were scared. Yeah. So they weren't going anywhere to steal the body. The Romans didn't have any skin in the game. The Jews, if they had the body, they would have produced it to show that the disciples were a bunch of liars. So none of those seem to hold any water at all. There's also this theory that seems to float around from time to time that let's see. That when this really doesn't have to do with the empty tomb, but it has to do with the appearances. There are those who claim that to have seen a dead body walking would prove you to have a few loose screws. And so in order to explain that away, there were those who would say that you were hallucinating if you saw a dead body walking. Now, today we'd say you just probably saw some special effects, that somebody really was a good special effects artist and you saw some. Have you seen these hologram things? I mean, those things really look real. I drove by a house the other night, Deborah. I drove by a house the other night and they've got this hologram thing out there, and it was a vampire on one side and a mummy on the other side, and they looked like real. I mean, they were about 9 feet tall and they looked pretty real as I was driving by, but okay, for one person to hallucinate might be a good explanation, but how many at one time does Paul say saw him? 500. So it's not likely that you're going to have 500 people hallucinating. So that's really a debate that really holds no weight at all, I think, besides the Lord making not just one or two appearances, but a number of appearances over a 40-day period. It's not like he just appeared on the day that he resurrected, and that was kind of the end of it, and there wasn't very much evidence, there wasn't many people to tell about it, but over a 40-day period, he began to show himself quite often to a lot of different people.
This I believe we miss sometimes. When Mary came to the apostles, she didn't say he has risen.
No.
She said somebody stole the body.
Mm-hmm. They've taken him, yeah.
Then when they went down there, the only one that tells us that it says he believed was John.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says about the rest of them, they did not understand the scriptures. So I believe that points to like Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing, and hearing the word of God. How important it is, they had seen all these miracles and everything, but yet they still did not believe because they did not understand the word.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that points to how important it is to understand the word.
And how important it is to be patient with ourselves till we come to a fuller understanding, and patient with others as well. Yeah, good point.
You had the Jesus' followers had to be early in the morning, saw the tomb empty. So then they began to spread the word. Do you think Caiaphas went to that tomb that day? Do you think Pilate went to the tomb that day? How many people do you think visited that tomb?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because they wanted to see themselves. They had guards there, guarding it. So why wouldn't the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all of them go to prove that it was wrong?
Mm-hmm.
They don't tell them how many fish that.
That's a good thought. I'd never really thought about that, but we don't have any record of who did, but it's very likely that a lot of those did to see for themselves. Going to the scene of the crime, so to speak.
Caiaphas probably went to see Pilate and wanted to know what happened to his God.
Yeah. Did you have something to do with this? Yeah. Okay, so verses 1 through 10 are the missing piece of this puzzle, if you want to kind of put it that way. You have John through all of these 19 chapters who's given us insight into what is taking place and what Jesus' purpose is, and he's building all of this up and providing all of this information as well as the evidence to prove that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, as well as being in the flesh, because it's going to be that fleshly body that comes out of that grave. That fleshly body is not going to stay there; it's coming out of that grave. And so the missing, I don't say missing, but the very last piece of this puzzle is there in verses 1 through 10. The tomb is empty. Mary goes to the tomb, and the tomb is empty. She goes then to Peter. Peter and John then run to the tomb, and there they see the tomb empty. So you have this, the final piece, the final thing that takes place, and that is the resurrection of Jesus, as the disciples are now beginning to see a clearer picture. As we've already stated, and we've stated it today, Ryan stated it well just now, but as we've stated many times, the disciples didn't have a full understanding yet. They're beginning to get to grasp it, and it's going to still be a little bit of time before they're going to be able to grasp what's taking place. But when you look at what now takes place in verses 11 and following, which is going to be that early in the morning where Mary is weeping outside this empty tomb, because as has already been stated, she believes that the body's been stolen, somebody's taken the body, and so she's outside this tomb, and she's weeping. Now, understand that the wording and the original language of what has just happened with Peter and John is that they examined the scene very well. They were observant. They were looking. They were with great thoughtfulness, looking at the scene that took place. Now, how much of that John recognized, we don't know, but some of that he did recognize, some understanding there in verse 10. So now he appears to Mary, verses 11 through 17. The way that he appears is the way that he also appears to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Notice that as he appears to her, here's what it says. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head, one at the foot. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Now remember, when Jesus, during this 40-day period, is walking with, as a matter of fact, right near this very same thing that's going on here, he joins up with those two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and it is also there that they don't recognize him, that for a period of time. Interestingly, until they stop and eat, and as they're eating, they then recognize who he is. So she doesn't recognize him. He said to her, verse 15, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She supposed that he was the gardener, and she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Well, why would she think this might be the gardener? Why would that be a rational thought in her mind? Yeah, that just would be the common sense thing. If somebody's there that early in the morning, it would be the one who would be the tender of the garden. And so she assumes that because somebody's there, that's probably who it is. And it was early in the morning. It was still dark, according to chapter 10, verse 1.
When you got people that you used to hear the church, you see them out somewhere sometime, you may not recognize them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it goes. But she was questioning those two angels, I guess. And it seemed like, to me, she was crying, and she wanted to know where Christ was. But I think of it, the angel may nod it toward the gardener, that would look like a gardener, or point it that way. Well, then she turns and she thinks it's a gardener. She turns and thinks it's a gardener. So anyway, that's nothing strange to not be expecting something and see it, and she may not look at Christ real well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what kind of garments he had on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the situation either, but it is interesting that the first part of this conversation, the first part of this, she has no clue who she's talking to until he says, Mary. Then she turned and said to him, Rabboni. I understand that means something like great teacher. That, by the way, was not something that you threw around loosely. That was not something that you would call every teacher, like rabbi. That carried with it some kind of designation of being a great teacher. So you have her coming to an understanding of who she's speaking to, and so she says, great teacher. And then you have that word from him not to cling to him. I'm going back to my Father. I'm going to ascend to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord, and that he had said these things to her. I've got, I guess in every Bible I've ever used, I've got those words underlined. I have seen the Lord, or whatever, however it's translated it, in whatever translation it might be. I have seen the Lord. The news was significant. It was a moment of realization. It was a moment of coming to grips with what has happened and what's going on. He was dead, and she says, I have seen the Lord. She preached that message. She gave out that good news. She went about telling the good news that the Lord is not dead. Say it again. Yeah, we don't have a record of what their initial reaction was, and we don't even know who she told exactly. We know she told the disciples, obviously, but who else did she tell? And what kind of reaction did she get? All right, in verses 19 and following, you have Jesus then appearing to the disciples behind the locked door. It's interesting that John would include this on the evening of that day. See, John, full speed ahead. He goes from early morning, where it's still probably just barely daylight by this time, and he fast forwards to the evening time. So in verse 19, you have this skipping forward to the night of the evening time. The doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, Peace be with you. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. I've over the study of this over the years, it seems to be more and more significant to me every time I read it that Jesus appears in their midst even though the door was locked. That within itself would have been a shock and a fright and a demonstration, wouldn't it, to the disciples? I'm sure at least one of them, or maybe more, looked to make sure the door was still locked. How did he get in here? But he's there, and he says to them, as he stood among them, now understand, they are already fearful. And if somebody shows up in their midst, their heart rate goes up, and their heart is throbbing in their throat probably, and they think they have been caught. We're next. So that's why Jesus says, "Peace, be still." Peace, the encouragement, it's okay. It's okay. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Why did he do that? Wasn't it enough that they saw him alive? I don't think it was significant enough that most folks wouldn't recognize him. I think what happened here was something that was so instantaneous and shocking that he appears among them in that room behind locked doors, and it's like, and then he says, okay, it's me. It's me. They were, yes, that they did not believe. Yes. Good point. So whatever is meant to be communicated here by John, to me it really is significant that he appears in the room with his disciples. The door is locked. He is there. And though he rebukes them, there is this seemingly instantaneous moment where he calms them, and then he shows them his hands and his feet. I was crucified. I was dead, and I'm now alive. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. I really don't know that. Somebody have a good idea of why he told her not to touch him? Or I feel like it's more like don't hold on to me. Don't cling, yeah. It wasn't don't touch, I think, as much as it was you're becoming too enamored by this body I'm in, and I'm going back to the Father's what he says. Don't hold on to the body, because this body's gone. It's like now, right? I mean, when I die, don't hold on to my body. All right, I'm through. Put his hands, yes, yeah. Yeah, I think it was don't hold on to me, don't cling to me.